Welcome, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for joining this month's Fireside Chat in honor of Acute Myeloid Leukemia, also known as AML Awareness Month. This Fireside Chat in particular is in sponsorship with Be the Match, an incredible organization dedicated to helping those in need of a life-saving transplant. We'll be hearing more about Be the Match and what they're doing, especially for patients with AML shortly. The Fireside Chats are brought to you by the Office of Community Outreach and Engagement at the Masonic Cancer Center at the University of Minnesota. The Office of Community Outreach and Engagement serves as a bridge between the Cancer Center and communities across the state of Minnesota and beyond. Our team's mission is to reduce the burden of cancer by engaging communities and providing them access to knowledge and information on the latest cancer research, cancer prevention, the importance of screening and early detection, treatment options, survivorship, as well as clinical research opportunities. My name is Amna Hussein. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator on our team, and I will be moderating our conversation today. As mentioned earlier, in June, we recognize AML. AML is an aggressive type of blood cancer that grows rapidly and can be life-threatening. Today, we have treatments that help people live longer with AML, which we will learn more about from our speakers. And today we are joined by four phenomenal people that I have the honor of introducing to you all. First, we will be hearing from Erica Ripken. She will share more about Be the Match. Erica is a clinical operations partner at the National Marrow Donor Program, also known as Be the Match. Erica provides customized support to help streamline processes and develop solutions to break down barriers for bone marrow transplant programs and patients. She has worked at Be the Match since 2008 and has had various roles in the organization supporting transplant centers and their patients. Next, we will be hearing from Dr. Heather Stefanski for an overview of AML and how Be the Match is helping those with AML. Dr. Stefanski joined Be the Match in May of 2021 as Vice President of Medical Services. Prior to her arrival, Dr. Stefanski was an Associate Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Minnesota and was actively involved in clinical care and research involving children with life-threatening blood and immune system disorders. One of her areas of focus is to use the cord blood units in stem cell transplant and other cellular therapy. She is board certified in both pediatrics and pediatric hematology oncology. Following Dr. Stefanski's presentation, we'll hear the remarkable journey of two AML survivors and transplant recipients, Elaine and Briles and Steve Buechler. Elaine and Steve will share their journey from diagnosis to survivorship. Their stories will truly inspire you. I will introduce Steve and Elaine later on in our program today. So for just a few housekeeping items before we kick things off, we will be recording today's session so you can refer back to the recording on the Masonic Cancer Center's YouTube page. Before we begin, we would like our audience to get familiar with using the Q&A feature, which is located on the bottom right of your Zoom window. During today's presentations, please use the Q&A feature to submit your comments, questions, and reactions. For University of Minnesota employees and spouses participating in the University of Minnesota's Employee Wellbeing Program, I'm going to put a link in the chat shortly so that you can complete a survey to mark your attendance and earn your wellbeing points. All right, without further ado, I will pass things over to Erica to get us started.
Thank you very much, Amna. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. This really, truly means a lot to us. I'm just going to share my screen. Give me one moment here. Well, I would like to just introduce you to who we are. So a little bit about Be the Match, who we are and what we do. We are a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to helping every patient get the life-saving transplant they need. As a recognized leader in unrelated marrow transplantation, Be the Match continues to develop services and interactive technologies used by transplant experts around the world to reach more patients. We also continue to lead the way in developing new cellular therapies and advancing services to speed transplant process and improving treatments for post-transplant complications. We invest in dedicated researchers whose countless hours in the lab and caring for patients have helped more patients than ever before received a transplant. Our commitment to fighting for a better outcomes and more lives saved continues. So our story was born of the love for a child. So when their 10-year-old daughter, Laura, was diagnosed with leukemia, Robert Graves and his wife, Sherry, were ready to do anything that they could do to help save her. So desperate to save her life, they turned to alternative treatment options. They agreed to try the first ever bone marrow transplant for a leukemia patient from an unrelated donor. Laura received her transplant in 1979 and it worked. The success of that treatment inspired the Graves to give other families the same hope for a cure. Thanks to Dr. Graves and other patients' families, doctors, congressional support, and funding from the US Navy, a national registry of volunteers willing to donate bone marrow was born. At the time, many people wondered who would step forward to donate bone marrow. Within the first year, the National Bone Marrow Donor Registry, as that's what we were called back then, was established. An astonishing 10,000 people answered the call. We conducted our first transplant as the National Marrow Donor Program in 1987 when Diane Walters of Wisconsin donated marrow to a 6-year-old Brooke Ward of North Carolina. It wasn't long before the program took off worldwide from a tiny little office in St. Paul, Minnesota. The National Marrow Donor Program was created so that all people, irrespective of background, could have access to unrelated bone marrow transplant. Our focus is meeting the cell therapy needs of our patients, and that is our core. Our mission is to save lives through cellular therapy. And how we do that is we are that proven partner connecting our transplant centers to the best available therapy for their patients. We're a global leader in research and advancing the future of care, and we are a tireless advocate for patients and cellular therapy providers. Together, we want to do all that we can do to make a difference at Be the Match. We want to be able to create awareness and be the light to help our patients in need, coming together to provide the power of possibility to all of our patients. So it's an absolute honor to be here today, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Stefanski.
Awesome. Thank you, Erica. And it's really fun to be here. The one thing that Amna did not say is that I was at the University of Minnesota for 27 years before I came to the National Marrow Donor Program. So it is really fun to be back. And I've actually seen some people that I used to work with on this call. So it's really fun. So I'm going to talk about some of the basics of AML. Oh, sorry, one thing. I was telling them I had to give a talk from in Mexico, and you can close caption PowerPoint in all sorts of languages. So anyway, I'm going to talk about AML past, present, and future. So what is, oh, it's still doing it, sorry. I want to make sure it's not doing it. Okay, what is AML? So it stands for Acute Myeloid Leukemia. And it accounts for 25% of all leukemias in adults in the Western world and is one of the most common and frequent forms of leukemia. It is also common in pediatrics, but not as common as it is in adults. Patients that are newly diagnosed with AML have a median age of 65 years. And this is showing the incidence rate per 100,000 persons in the different age groups. So you can see that as people age, that the incidence goes up. So what do you normally do for the treatment of AML? So there's a number of things that we need to consider. So first, if you have a suspected diagnosis of AML, and typically, well, it'll be interesting to see what Elaine and Steve say when they were diagnosed, but typically patients with acute myeloid leukemia are relatively sick by the time they are diagnosed. They may have an insidious onset where may have not been feeling well for a little bit, and then just feel worn down, tired, maybe have some bruising, and go and see their physician and then get a complete blood count and find out that in fact, either their white count can be very, very high or very, very low. And so there's a number of studies that are also done to understand if there's effects on some of the organ systems in the body. And so in order to assess for leukemia, a bone marrow biopsy and aspirate is also performed. And as we are learning more and more about leukemia, we have discovered that there are certain genetic modifications in different types of leukemia that cause it. And so when we're looking for leukemia, not only do we look at it and what it looks like underneath the microscope, which will tell us whether it's a myeloid blast or a lymphoid blast or a different type of leukemia. But also we're looking for flow cytometry, which is a specialized machine that looks at different types of protein on the cell surface. And we also look at cytogenetics, which are truly key to figuring out what type of leukemia a patient has and what does that mean for that patient, because we know in certain subtypes that they're really good risk factors, for example, but some of them are not as good of risk factors. And so once a patient is diagnosed, they typically will undergo a type of chemotherapy. So first you want to determine if a patient is fit for intensive chemotherapy, because AML needs pretty intensive chemotherapy. And then depending on the type of risk factors that are part of it, so whether it's favorable risk factor, intermediate risk, or adverse risk, meaning not great risk, that will determine sort of what type of chemotherapy and other types of treatment options that patient has. And then if a patient is unfit for higher dose chemotherapy, then they'll undergo different types of therapy depending, again, on their risk. And this is sort of a complicated slide, but I just wanted you to see sort of what, that it's really important about the cytogenetics. So this, don't worry, there's not going to be a question and answer about all of these different chromosomes, but I just want to show you how complicated AML is. There's multiple deletions, there's inversions, there's translocations, there's trisomies. And what that means is there's actually an extra chromosome as part of it. There's complex karyotypes as well. And even for a physician that treats these type of patients, you can see that, in fact, looking at, is it favorable? Is it, what is the prognostic indicator here? And then honestly, one of the other important things is, what is the response to chemotherapy? And so we've learned a few things about what the responses are depending upon what types of cytogenetics the patient has, but that doesn't necessarily translate to everything. And then this is looking at overall survival. So what I wanted to depict in this slide is truly the advances and frankly, how long it's taken to get advances for AML therapy. So in 1973, it was initially the 7+3 regimen, which is very common, was shown to have good outcomes for AML or better outcomes for AML. And then not until 1990, was idarubicin approved for AML. And then in 2000, gemtuzumab, which targets CD33, which is very common. It's a protein that's found on the AML cell surface, was approved. And then, unfortunately, in 2010, it was withdrawn from the market because patients that had received this drug, although it was good for AML, wasn't good for one of the side effects, which was veno-occlusive disease. So despite it being good for AML, if you're not going to survive from the therapy, then we're not going to give you that therapy. And then you can see really something happened in 2017 where there were many drugs that were then brought onto the market. So midostaurin chemotherapy was approved, enasidenib was approved, CPX-351, which was a new way to treat AML. Gemtuzumab was then brought back onto the market and was a little bit better. It was used in a different type of therapy to not cause as bad a veno-occlusive disease. And then in 2018, you can see that there are also a number of other improved therapies. Gilteritinib is very commonly used for AML. It's a FLT3 inhibitor. And then other things that have been pivotal are oral azacitidine. So this now, instead of having to be IV or a different formulation, patients could now use this orally. And then also some low dose therapies were also being able to use. So this really changed the face of AML therapy, where patients had to initially immediately go into the hospital and be there for months potentially. Now we have new things that can be used to treat AML. But what happens when a patient needs a transplant? And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And so in this case, not all patients are going to need a transplant, right? There's some favorable risk factors with certain types of AML that mean that they can deal with conventional chemotherapy. But there's other types of AML where just even the standards that we have currently aren't good enough. And so, those are the patients that need a stem cell transplant. And so what happens in a stem cell transplant is that you have an unrelated or related donor, and they're going to give you a type of stem cell, which I will go over in a few minutes. These stem cells are going to be processed and then potentially frozen. The patient is going to get chemotherapy to set them up for transplant. And this can either be what we call myeloablative or very high dose chemotherapy. And what I mean by that is that the chemotherapy is going to get rid of all of the stem cells that are in the bone marrow cavity, which the bone marrow is very important for making red cells, white cells, and platelets. And if you get rid of the stem cells that are able to create those cells, then you need a new stem cell source. There's also what we call reduced intensity chemotherapy, where it doesn't completely wipe it out. But with the new stem cells that come in, this actually creates a whole new immune system and can cause what we call a graft versus leukemia effect. So then the patient, once they receive this chemotherapy, is ready for the infusion of stem cells. And for those of you that don't know, these don't have to be given into the bone marrow cavity themselves. They can actually be given through a peripheral or a Hickman catheter, which is a central venous catheter. So the principles of it are you're delivering high dose chemotherapy basically to eradicate the leukemia that was very resistant to the typical doses of chemotherapy. And so this also immunosuppresses the recipient. And then you replace the abnormally functioning bone marrow cells with healthy hematopoietic cells, and then give the patient a new immune system. So there's a number of different sources that we can use. The first that was found was bone marrow. So this is a traditional source of stem cells. The issue with it is that donors have to undergo general anesthesia and a bone marrow harvest via multiple aspirates from the bilateral iliac crest, which is essentially your lower hip bones, the back of your lower hip bones. And then we have a target. And within the bone marrow, that's where really all of these good stem cells live. And that was the first thing that was used for allogeneic stem cell transplants. We then discovered that there are ways to get stem cells that are typically in the bone marrow to go out into the peripheral blood. And so we now use peripheral blood stem cells. This is in about 80 to 85% of all of our products that the NMDP, or the National Marrow Donor Program, delivers. This is much more common. And the reason for that is it's easier to collect from donors. They're awake. They get a big bore IV in that can actually collect these cells, and then these cells can be infused, and they're collected with by apheresis, and they're done typically in partnership with our blood pathologists. And then another source of hematopoietic stem cells that the University of Minnesota is known for is umbilical cord blood. So it was discovered in Hal Broxmeyer's lab that you could actually find stem cells in umbilical cord blood. And this truly was, we didn't initially collect this from babies, and it's essentially a waste product, right? Like you throw away the placenta and the umbilical cord. Well, what we discovered was that, in fact, this is very rich for stem cells. And so in 1988, the first related umbilical cord blood transplant was done for Fanconi anemia, which is a bone marrow failure syndrome. And this was done in Elaine and Steve lab in France. And then in 1993 to 94, the first unrelated umbilical cord blood transplant was done by Dr. John Wagner, who is at the University of Minnesota. And so again, this is just another stem cell source that can be used. So I just wanted to, again, I know Erica had gone over a little bit about this, but I wanted to talk about transplant and our place in history. And so for those of you that didn't know, in 1968, the first successful related donor transplant was done at the University of Minnesota by Dr. Wood. And it was very exciting when I was there as a treating physician to celebrate all of the good things that the University of Minnesota has done. In 1973, the first successful unrelated donor transplant was performed. And then in 1979, Laura Graves, who was very brave, who got someone off the registry for ALL. And then in 1986, as Erica said, the NBMDR was established. In 1987, we had 2 transplants that were completed. And then today, we have the world's most diverse registry at Be the Match. There's over 41 million adult donors worldwide that we are able to search for patients. We have over 400,000 cord blood units that are on our registry as well. And we have facilitated over 121,000 transplants. We also are amazing at logistics, and we facilitate over 7,000 unrelated donor and related donor transplants annually, along with some other cell therapies. And really, the reason that we are so successful is because we have 35 years of uninterrupted support from our federal government, as well as the Navy. So it's really, it's a privilege to work here and to see what the NMDP can do. So in looking at the transplants, this is looking at transplants that were reported to the CIBMTR. So for those of you that don't know, it's the Center for International Blood and Marrow Transplant Research. And essentially, all transplants that occur need to be reported to the CIBMTR. And this is truly phenomenal in that we can make decisions about how to make transplant better. And I don't have a slide to show that, but each year, outcomes of stem cell transplant, especially allogeneic transplant, get better and better. And that's because of what we're able to learn from how we used to do transplants and what we're going to do now. So this is looking at the number of transplants. And then here, this is looking at the years. And you can see that, you know, for allogeneic transplants, it's continuing to go up. There was a little blip. We had something called COVID that frankly, I'm not going to talk about today, but what the NMDP did to pivot from that and to basically be able to deliver products in a worldwide pandemic when borders were closed and it was impossible to get things throughout the world. It's pretty impressive. But still, you know, if a patient needs a transplant, they need a transplant, and people were willing to go above and beyond. There's also a number of autologous transplants that occur in the United States. This is for different types of diseases. Multiple myeloma is one of them. And then this is looking at the different types of allogeneic transplants. So we have different types of where you can get stem cells from. So we have match-related donors. This typically includes a sibling. We have matched unrelated donors. So this is where we're matching at basically 8 out of 8 of the haplotypes that we're looking at. So this is what makes patients unique and us unique. But we know that we need to match this uniqueness at a certain level in order for transplants to potentially be successful, although I will talk about that in a minute. Haplotransplants are basically from a family member, and it means that it's half matched. So like you could be half matched to a cousin or even a brother or sister or a parent, for example. Mismatched unrelated donors. So this is where they're not perfectly matched, and we're actually seeing an increase in the numbers of mismatched unrelated donors. And again, that is because we are able to improve transplant with some of the graft versus host disease prophylaxis that we use. There's other mismatched relatives are shown here, and then cord blood. So cord blood has decreased really in the number of times that it is used, and most likely related to the other types of stem cell sources. I think one of the other exciting things about this is because transplants have gotten safer and we've gotten much better, we're able to use different stem cell sources like haplo, as well as mismatched unrelated donors. So looking at, where it began to where it is now, you can see that there's a huge increase in the percentage of haplo donors. Also an increase in the mismatched unrelated donors. And then there's a decrease in the number of cord blood, as well as other mismatched relative, and then a decrease in the match related donors. So it's always interesting to see, where this data is going. I think one of the other aspects of transplant that is very exciting is that now, because we have this reduced intensity regimen, we're able to transplant older patients. And that means that even, like we have transplanted an 80-year-old because we're able to do reduced intensity and have some novel ways of doing this. And so as transplants get safer and safer, where potentially patients that were older really didn't have hope in order to be cured, now we're able to give them hope. And so this is looking at the types of transplants that they're getting depending on what their ages are. And you can see it's relatively, it's different, especially in between, cord blood is much more common in children than it is in adults, which you can see here. And then matched unrelated donors is more common in the 65 and plus. So one of the other beauties about transplant is that it has truly been a platform for so many other therapies and how we can treat other things besides AML, and actually in the way that we treat AML. So when you think about it, transplant is fantastic, but can we be better? Still one of the biggest risks after transplant is relapse. So how do we prevent relapse? Well, there's a number of different ways. One is there's something called natural killer cells or NKT cells. There's also a type of T cell that are gamma delta T cells that can be infused or try to actually increase them after transplant. There's CAR T cells. So these are chimeric antigen receptor T cells that actually could interact with the type of leukemia that a patient has. Right now, it's much more readily used in something called acute lymphoblastic leukemia or ALL. We are working on AML. There's a CD33, well, there's a number of CD33 type CARs. Also infusion of antigen-specific T cells for both graft versus leukemia effect. One of the other risk factors for patients is infections after transplant. And that's because they have to remain immunosuppressed in order for their new stem cells to be educated to have the new immune system. And so there are other ways that we can try to improve immunity after transplant. And then also like graft versus host disease. So, there's novel ways that we're trying to prevent graft versus host disease. So graft versus host disease is a risk of transplant in that is where the T cells that are infused can actually react to the recipient and say, I don't like you. And so I'm going to not interact with different organs in the body. One of them being skin, that's very common, and it's a site of graft versus host disease. And also the gut is also very common. So how do we prevent that graft versus host disease? And one of the novel ways that we've been doing this is with something called post-transplant cyclophosphamide. So post-transplant cyclophosphamide was initially used in haplotransplants, and it basically what it does is it kills all of the T cells that are in that graft that are mature, because those are the ones that are going to cause the graft versus host disease. And so this has really allowed us then to use more haplos as well as to use more mismatched unrelated donors. There's also a number of other novel therapies such as ruxolitinib, which is a JAK inhibitor. JAK is just a type of, it's an abnormal protein that is found in the cell that can cause problems. And then also MSCs or mesenchymal stem cells, that these can be used as infusion to help with graft versus host disease. And then I'm thinking of transplant and how do you translate to other things? You can actually do this for solid tumors and autoimmune diseases. So multiple sclerosis is one of the things. As a pediatrician, we use transplant for many genetic disorders such as Hurler's disease, adrenoleukodystrophy, bone marrow failure syndromes. And so other ways is that you can take these stem cells and genetically modify them and then use them for gene therapy. So I think, in thinking about where AML was, where truly when I showed that first picture, 1970, right? Like we basically had one thing to treat AML. And then that's what all patients got. And we didn't even put them into categories of what their AML looked like, what their subtype was. We've gotten so much more sophisticated, and we have drugs that can actually treat different types of the genetic modifications. And so, where we're going is more personalized medicine. And I think, the goal is, now patients are living much longer after transplant, and even with these different types of therapies. So how do we make it so these therapies are safer and patients and recipients don't have to have these long-term side effects? So with that, I am going to stop sharing, and I will let our other two speakers talk about their journey.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stefanski, for providing such an in-depth overview of AML and the treatments that are currently on the market used to treat AML, in addition for providing such incredible work, the incredible work that Be The Match is doing to save patient lives. So next we will be hearing from Elaine and Steve. Both will be sharing their cancer journeys with you all. And first we will be hearing from Elaine. So in 2015, Elaine retired from a 40-year career in trucking management with plans to travel, paint, and garden. 11 years later, Elaine was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. After 4 years of treatment, primarily chemotherapy, she underwent a successful bone marrow transplant. Because Elaine had a talented team of transplant specialists and a perfect match from Eastern Europe, she has been leukemia-free for 4 years and 8 months. Elaine is a volunteer in the Peer Connect program with Be The Match, and she volunteers as a First Connect with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. She is also a coach for Health Tree. Elaine believes her experiences and her leukemia journey can help other patients. Along with volunteering, Elaine lives in a rural area in Northeast Texas with her husband and 2 dogs. She currently enjoys gardening and traveling in their 5th-wheel RV. I am honored to introduce to you all Elaine. Elaine, please tell us a little bit more about your AML journey and your transplant journey as well.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate y'all allowing me to be here to tell this story. I always shy from saying an AML journey because journeys have beginning and endings usually. And this is more of a situation where you're never really cured, I don't think. A transplant is great. And if I can live 5 years with it, I feel like I'll have a successful transplant. But anyway, after hearing the doctor speak, I wish I had known some of the things she went over when I was making my decisions about what kind of treatment I was going to have. I was diagnosed in November of 2016, and they diagnosed me with acute myeloid leukemia, and I had a gene mutation of NPM1C, and I was told that was a better, if you've got to have leukemia, that's a good gene mutation to have, because I had no FLT3 mutations. I met with an oncologist and a transplant doctor, and from my first day in the hospital, the transplant doctor encouraged me to work toward a transplant. So I started the pre-treatment. First, I started the treatment to try to get in remission. At the time, I had 39% blast, so I had a lot of leukemia cells. I started the 7+3 treatment. That was called induction therapy, I think, back then. And I was in the hospital 41 days. And then I came back for more treatment and was in for another 30 days. And then a relapse. I went in remission, and then I had a relapse in February of 2019. And at that point, I had a choice. If I could get back in remission, I could have a stem cell transplant. But the transplant doctor was not willing to do it unless I was absolutely zero, or as much zero as you can get with leukemia cells, because of my age. And that was an issue. I was 66 at the time. And then they didn't like to transplant people over a certain age. And I think it was 73. So I barely got through that. But I had a step back therapy or step back transplant. I didn't have the intensive transplant if I had been younger and probably healthier. But I began the transplant trying to get in remission again. And I checked into the hospital finally in October 10th of 2019. And in the meantime, my donor, who was a young man from Scotland, had gone into the hospital and he was taking treatment to try to get stem cells really active where he would have plenty to give. I'm probably not putting that in medical terminology, but you get my drift. And so on October 17th, we were ready for the transplant. He had done his donation 2 days before, and they flew them from Scotland to Dallas. It took about 25 minutes to do the transfusion of the stem cells. And I've had a few setbacks. It hasn't been an easy journey. In fact, I tell people, while I was taking the treatment to kill my bone marrow prior to the transplant, there were about 4 days that I thought I might die. And 2 of those days, I knew I was going to, but you get over that. And nurses and doctors knew what to do. I had a few setbacks. I've had GVHD. I've had prior to my transplant, I had a lot of blood transfusions, but I'm still healthy. And I feel like that if I haven't beaten leukemia, I've at least put it in the background. So that's my story. I'm kind of a boring person. I didn't have a lot of dramatic medical strives to try to get me where I am now, but I had some good doctors, and apparently my donor was very healthy because he gave me some great stem cells. In fact, when I finally got in contact with him, I told him he had a very active life. I said, I feel kind of guilty because I'm not like that. I'm afraid you're going to think you wasted your stem cells on me. And he said, no, he didn't think that, but I'm very thankful and will be thankful to him for the rest of my life. That's my story.
Incredible. Elaine, thank you so much for sharing your story with all of us today. So next we will be hearing from Steve Buechler. Steve is an emeritus professor of sociology and a distinguished faculty scholar at Minnesota State University, Mankato. He is also the author of 7 academic books on women's movements, social movement theory, and critical sociology. When he's not playing professor, his favorite pastimes have included paddling Minnesota's boundary waters, canoe area, wilderness, cruising the Mediterranean, playing poker in Las Vegas, and patronizing a local pool hall. He lives in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, and he's also on Facebook at Steve Buechler Author. 1 year before his retirement date in 2017, he was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia and treated with chemotherapy, radiation, and a double umbilical cord blood transplant. Throughout this time, he has turned his writing skills to narrating his cancer odyssey. While doctors treated his disease, telling his story maintained his sanity. His memoir, How Steve Became Ralph, A Cancer and Stem Cell Odyssey with Jokes, is available at his website, www.stevebuechlerauthor.com. Steve, please share with us a little bit more about your AML journey and your transplant story as well.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. My story has some similarities, but also some differences from Elaine. So we'll get to see some other dimensions of this process. The two most striking things at the beginning of my experience are that first, I knew nothing about AML. I couldn't have defined leukemia. I'd had virtually no exposure to cancer at the tender age of 64 when I was diagnosed. And the second thing is it all moved incredibly fast, which is fairly common for AML. As people noted, it was in 2016. I had a routine physical scheduled, and I thought, I don't know why I need to go to that. I don't have any symptoms. I don't have any complaints. I don't have any issues. And I almost skipped it. But at the last minute, I thought, well, I'll go. It's probably the right thing to do. And they discovered my white blood cell count was really dangerously low, and that triggered some concern. I was pretty blasé about it because, like I said, I felt fine. I had no symptoms. Surely I would know if I had cancer, right? Maybe. So I ended up with a bone marrow biopsy, and it detected AML with 50% blasts. And it was a pretty unusual week. The bone marrow biopsy was on Monday. On Tuesday, I swam my normal 50 laps, did some shopping, ate dinner out, perfectly normal day. Wednesday morning, I played in a home poker game with some retired guys. Wednesday afternoon, I returned home and I got the phone call that said, this is what you have. It's very serious. You have to get to a hospital immediately. We made an appointment for you the next day and you need to show up and check in. This is a little spooky because I received my diagnosis on June 15th of 2016, exactly 7 years ago today, was my diagnosis and my admission to hospital. I'd barely been in the hospital a half a day, one night, when my wife, Sue, decided to join me in the hospital by showing up at the emergency room with a fractured femur. So I was on the 4th floor about to get a week-long session of chemotherapy. She was on the 6th floor waiting for and then recovering from surgery for her broken leg. And it was an odd time, to say the least. She was then discharged to a transitional care unit for a month of rehab before she could go home. And I knew I'd be in the hospital for another 4 or 5 weeks before I could go home. So our house was unoccupied unexpectedly for well over a month. I had the standard of care, 7+3, cytarabine and idarubicin. It's interesting, at the time, they just said, this is the treatment. And I said, okay, let's go. Now that there are newer treatments, I hear what I went through referred to as harsh and brutal and tough and all that kind of stuff, but they didn't say that at the time. And it's probably just as well. They told me the chemo effects, the side effects will probably show up about day 10. And I got to day 10 and was doing pretty well. So I got a little cocky and thought, I think maybe I'm going to beat this thing and show them. Well, they were off by one day. On day 11, everything hit the fan. And it was a horrible 2 weeks. I'll spare you the descriptions because it was just plain ugly. In the middle of that 2-week period, that would be the 3rd week I'm in the hospital, a wicked thunderstorm came through our neighborhood and it brought down the 60-foot locust tree in our front yard and the 60-foot silver maple tree in our backyard. They both crashed into the roof and deck and gutters of our unoccupied home. Maybe it was just as well we weren't home, who knows? But you can't make this stuff up. And if you did, who would believe it? But then things got better. As I moved into week 4 and week 5, they did another biopsy and it was clean. So in the matter of a month, the induction chemotherapy had gotten me into at least a temporary remission. My counts were recovering, my symptoms were improving. And after 37 days, they discharged me to go home and move on to the next stage. That really involved a waiting game because they were going to do the molecular and cytogenetic testing that's been described here in an earlier talk. And what I was told is that will determine if you're in a high risk category or a low risk category. If it's low risk, you can probably get by with additional chemotherapy. If it's high risk, you're probably going to need a stem cell transplant. So I thought at least there's going to be a clear fork in the road and the decision will basically make itself. To my surprise, the result was I was in an intermediate risk category. And so I asked them, what do I do? And they used a lot of fancy medical jargon to say, we don't know. But it was suggested that I do some consultations. And so I went to the University of Minnesota Medical Center and their transplant center, had a 3-hour meeting with nurses and social workers and a transplant specialist. I then returned to my community oncologist and talked with her. I then got second opinions at the Mayo Clinic. The most definitive thing I heard is when I went back to my community oncologist, everybody would just say, well, here are the risks, here are the benefits, but no one came out with a real recommendation. So my wife was along with me and she said to my oncologist, if Steve was your husband, what would you want him to do? And she immediately said, get a transplant. So that's how you elicit your doctor's advice, is you personalize it in that way. So I gave it some more thought, but eventually I opted for transplant and really committed to it. My logic was that if I had chemotherapy and it didn't work out, I'd really regret not getting the transplant. But if I had the transplant and it didn't work out, I think at least I would feel like I gave it my best shot. And okay, maybe it just wasn't meant to be. So at that point, I needed a donor. And they said, well, we're going to test your brother, my one sibling. And he turned out pretty commonly to be a half match or a haploidentical donor. And they said, well, that's a possible donor, but maybe we could do better. We should look at cord blood. And that sounded like science fiction to me. I was unfamiliar with all of this stuff. But they said, well, cord blood can be a viable alternative. So I said, okay, well, what should I do? And again, they said, we don't know. But they said, we do have a clinical trial. Maybe you could go in the trial. And what the trial will do is we'll randomly assign you to your half-match brother or to the cord blood group, and we'll simply track your progress all the way through. And in the few years from now, we can see whether the cord blood is a little better or a little less effective than the matched or half-matched sibling. And since I had no better way of distinguishing between what was best or what was worst for me, I said, okay, put me in the study. They rolled the dice and I ended up in the cord blood arm of the study. So my brother was off the hook. And my fate was in the hands of, I think of them as an infant boy and infant girl, but it's really their mothers who donated their umbilical cords to a blood bank, and they were there when I needed them. Now, it was taking a while to get to transplant, so they said you should probably have a round of consolidation chemotherapy to keep you in remission until we can get there. So I did that, and a week after that, I woke up with uncontrolled bleeding and went back into the hospital, and they said, well, we checked your platelets, and they should be somewhere between 150 and 450, but my platelet count was 4. So they said, there's nothing there to prevent bleeding and promote clotting. So we're going to keep you here for another week and do some daily double platelet transfusions, which they did. And then it was time for transplant. I went through the workup. They tested my heart, liver, lungs, kidneys, everything they could find. And that all checked out. So I checked in on day -7. That's the countdown that begins to day 0 when you have the transplant. They treated me with pre-transplant Cytoxan, fludarabine, and total body irradiation. I later learned that, this is a fun fact, Cytoxan is actually derived from the mustard gas used in World War I as chemical warfare. So it's pretty important that you get the dose right, and they did. So I was discharged from the transplant hospital 17 days after transplant, relatively early. I was doing fairly well. And at one point they just said, you're probably safer being at home than hanging out in the hospital with all the germs and that kind of stuff we have here. So the first month at home was probably the roughest. I had unimaginable fatigue, residual nausea. I could literally feel my bones aching. And I thought of that as the stem cells sort of digging in and making a home for themselves. So that was the roughest time. And I had to go back for daily clinic visits. My caregivers would drive me back there every day. And depending on whether I needed platelets or red blood cells or both, that could be a 2-hour trip or it could be an 8-hour trip. You never knew ahead of time. But there was gradual improvement as I moved toward day 100, some complications and bumps in the road. I had 2 flare-ups of the cytomegalovirus, had some other complications here and there. But I was very carefully monitored, and I really appreciated the attentiveness of my transplant doctor, who really kept an eye on things and managed those symptoms as well as they could be managed. After day 100, they said, well, now we're going to begin to taper your anti-rejection medications. We're going to do it very gradually. Over the next 3 months, we'll just kind of step you all the way down to nothing. And that was to allow my immune system to begin to function, but still hold off any graft versus host disease. And they really orchestrated that transition just about perfectly. So at the 6-month consultation, again, they did another bone marrow biopsy. It was clean. And as I left that appointment, before I left, I asked my transplant oncologist, I've been seeing you daily and then 3 times a week and then at least once a week. So when do I see you next? And she shrugged her shoulders and said, well, maybe 6 months. That was pretty unnerving. But she said, Steve, it's a good thing when you don't have to see your doctor. So to me, that was a significant turning point. And I began to think of myself as transitioning from patient to survivor. 9 months after all of this, I was invited to give a keynote address at the fundraiser for my transplant unit. And that landed me at Lake Nokomis on a sun-kissed Saturday morning, and I spoke to 400 people, and they cheered wildly when I said I was doing well. But the even better part was I ended up with a 40-minute walk around Lake Nokomis with my transplant oncologist. And that was pretty special. It looked normal to anyone else, you know, two people in sneakers and shorts walking around the lake, but it was in the back and the front of my mind that she'd basically saved my life. And here we are chatting and walking around the lake like normal people. That was pretty powerful. Eventually, they redid my childhood vaccinations at year 1 and year 2. I've since experienced just a full recovery. All my labs have been normal for the last 5 years, including yesterday. I just had my semi-annual consult and my quarterly blood draw. That's all looking good. So I was incredibly fortunate. I really hit the treatment trifecta. I got into remission on the first attempt. I had full donor engraftment within about 3 weeks, and I've had no graft versus host disease. And the likelihood of all 3 of those things happening together is pretty low. So I consider myself very fortunate. And that has left me with unbounded amounts of gratitude. And I'm sort of trying to pay it back by being a cancer community volunteer in many different capacities. And I don't think I'll ever pay off the debt I feel like I owe, but I'm going to keep trying because that's a very fulfilling way to give back. So that's believe it or not, that's the short version of my story. I'm going to turn it back to Amna at this point.
Wow, thank you so much, Steve, for joining us and sharing your story on your 7th diagnosis anniversary. That's what are the odds? So it's just so great to hear that both you and Elaine are doing well and thriving years after your diagnosis. So we are going to start transitioning to the discussion portion of our program today. And as most of you know, if you've attended Fireside Chats before, it is not a fireside chat without getting our fire going. So I have our fire started here. And this is a campfire because we're in our warmer month. So no need for a colder or an indoor fire. So we are going to kick things off here. We've had quite a few questions submitted through our registration. And so Dr. Stefanski, I'll actually start with you. We've had this question submitted, and I think it's a good one for you to answer. So what is the prognosis of AML if one chooses not to have a stem cell transplant?
Oh, well, that is not an easy question to answer because it depends on so many different things. And we're in a different era now, right? So, I hope, one of the take-home messages from one of the slides that I showed is that there's new therapies that are coming up and up. But I would say if a patient has high-risk AML and that they've relapsed multiple times, the likelihood that they're going to get into remission by just conventional sorts of chemotherapy, that is not going to work, and that they need something either personalized, like a CAR T cell that's going to be specific for that leukemia, or they're going to need some other new targeted therapy that's going to come on the market. And even with some of the inhibitors, so like someone had mentioned FLT3. FLT3 is it isn't as great of a prognostic indicator for, AML. It's one of the poor ones, but it has new inhibitors now, like oral medications that you can take that can try to prevent that. And so let's say they're on a certain medication and then they become resistant to that. There might be another different type of medication that they could take. So it really there's so many factors that depend on where you are. And then one interesting thing that I actually didn't mention that Steve had said was that he was in a really good remission. So before, we used to look at leukemia underneath the microscope. And basically, if the patient had less than 5% blasts, it was like, oh, you can go to transplant. Well, we found that in fact, if you have 5% blast, the likelihood that transplant's going to work for you, probably not super great. You need to be in a deeper remission, meaning that you can't see it underneath the microscope, and hopefully you can't see it by other means. So it's an evolving field, but I think it's very more exciting than it used to be, where, there weren't a lot of options.
Great, thank you for that, Dr. Stefanski. So Erica, quick question for you. How does one get involved with Be the Notch, and how can our audience on the call today help raise awareness about getting involved?
Well, I love that question. So thank you, whoever submitted that. So I definitely, please go to bethematch.org. You can learn so much about our organization and ways that you can get involved. If you are interested in wanting to join our registry, we do recruit between the ages of 18 and 40. And actually the higher chances is really 18 to 35, but you can learn about what that process is like. If you are wanting to eventually maybe someday be that person that could be found to be a match for that patient. And you can join a registry through our website, and they will send that buccal swab kit to you, swab your cheeks and get that back in, and you would be on our registry for all of our transplant centers to be looking for that potential match in the world. If you are what I always call overqualified, so over that age group, there's so many ways you can get back. We are always looking for volunteers. We have a lot of different recruitment drives, a lot of beautiful community events, and those are all posted on our website as well. And definitely you can always, reach out to me too, and I can get you connected.
Great, Erica. So Elaine and Steve, I have a question to ask you two. So is it possible to live a quality of life after an AML diagnosis? I mean, your story would obviously speak to that, but tell us again, please.
Well, Steve, or you, I don't know if I overspoke you or not, but yeah, you can. I mean, I think we're living proof. Maybe your idea of a great life may change, where I'm not quite as mobile as I used to be. So it's difficult. When I retired, I had planned on volunteering at the Veterans Hospital close to us. Well, I really don't want to be around a lot of sick people. I hate to say it that way, but I don't need to be around a lot of flu and different things. But, that doesn't stop me from getting on the phone and volunteering for Be the Match or other organizations. And that's really kind of what I like doing now, where before, maybe I did something differently, but you change how you see your life. And some things certainly don't mean as much to me now as they did 10 years ago when I was working. We're not promised a specific time on earth. So I think if you can find something to make your time worthwhile, yes, you can live a good life. Steve, did I say that incorrectly? Do you think you can?
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly. And in fact, I would present myself as Exhibit A. If I were prone to guilt, I would almost feel guilty over how completely I've recovered. I'm back to all my swimming, all my regular activities. I've added weightlifting. Other than a late afternoon nap, my energy is as good as it ever was. I would be hard pressed to identify any lingering effect in a negative way from my illness and my treatment. Although we're monitoring cardiotoxicity from some of the chemo regimens I had, that's a concern when you get 5 to 10 years out, but so far the echoes are looking good. And so I guess I'm at one end of a spectrum of the most positive possible outcomes. And that fuels the drive to volunteer and give back as much as I can, because I've been granted a real gift. As Elaine said, if you go through this thing and it doesn't change you in lots of ways, you really weren't paying attention. I mean, there's all kinds of things that change in terms of your priorities and your values and how you see the world and how you see other people in the world. And we'd need a whole nother talk show to get through all of that. But yeah, it has a profound impact, to be sure.
And I think when you make a decision on what treatment you're going to do because when you find out you're diagnosed to the time they need to start something to stop the leukemia, you don't have a lot of time. Right. But if you can make your decision that you're going to seek a transplant or try CAR-T or do any other kind of medicine, you got to do it quickly and just be satisfied with what you've done and don't look back.
Yeah, I think there's some evidence these days that you can wait a little longer perhaps than you did before, where they rushed me into treatment within 1 day of the diagnosis. Yeah. There's a little cushion now with some other medications, and some research suggests maybe things don't get that much worse that quickly, but you don't want to be too tardy with it for sure.
Yeah.
I think Steve and Elaine, you are such inspirations, and I can only imagine, as patients that are undergoing therapy now to see you living this life that is amazing and fulfilling in obviously a different way. But I just think, oh my gosh, these patients are so lucky to have you, if you're talking to them, and what an inspiration you both have been.
Truly. And I know we're at time, but there's just a few questions that I have to ask. So, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So if you need to hop off, please do. But Erica, I saw that you unmuted, so go ahead.
Oh, no, I just was going to say that Dr. Stefanski, you said it just so perfectly. I mean, we are so grateful as an organization to have both Elaine and Steve for all that you do for Be the Match and all of our patients and their families. I mean, really, honestly, forever grateful for that. And I was speaking to many colleagues, and they just lit up when they saw that you were going to be a part of the session today. So thank you for that.
I get much more out of it than I give. I get much more out of the volunteering than what I give, believe me. And I'm sure Steve feels the same way.
And I saw, so in the chat, we have just a few questions, Erica, that you can probably speak to, just about asking if Be the Match has any like support groups that patients and their caregivers can attend, and where can we find information on some of those upcoming events?
We do actually have a survivorship program. So we do have actually through our patient support center and our patient vertical, we do have opportunity to be able to have additional services and have that one-on-one support, as well as our peer-to-peer connect program. And so we do have more information actually on our website, but definitely I can get more information if I can get Amna that maybe detailed information from that individual. If that is possible, I could definitely get you connected to my colleagues at Be the Match and ensure that we get you set up with the right resources to be able to help you.
Awesome. And then someone asked about the recording. So the recording will be sent out. But one question for Elaine and Steve before we wrap things off. But what resources have you found most helpful during those most difficult times? And Steve, you can start.
I came to think of them as really as coping strategies. I thought we need a division of labor here. It's up to the doctors to cure my body, but it's up to me to kind of sustain my identity. And I sort of backed into a number of things. I'll just mention very briefly that were extremely helpful. I learned a bit about mindfulness, meditation, and yoga, helped keep me centered, kept me in the present. I was determined to do a lot of physical activity. I'm the rare guy that welcomed the physical therapist when they came to my room and gave me stretchy bands and isometric exercises, but mostly I roamed the halls of my hospital 5 miles a day. I just loved getting out of my room and being up and active. So proactive patient, rearranged my room, chatted up the nurses, had questions for doctors, maintained my somewhat twisted sense of humor, bought into a scientific worldview of what was going on. But writing my story was really crucial. I wrote it to keep other people informed, but it quickly became therapy for me. And true to my spirit, every one of the 65 emails I sent out that ended up in my book ended with a joke of the day. And they're terrible jokes. That's the point. But they were still somehow funny. So those 6 things really kept me going. And to this day, I draw on those for all kinds of life challenges.
Elaine?
Well, I'm kind of a slug. I wasn't as I didn't exercise like Steve did, but I did have therapy the whole time I was there. In fact, someone that visited me said, "This is like a spa. You have people coming in all the time working with you." And I said, "Well, wait till you get to the food, and it is not spa food." But I took a lot of comfort from my family members. I have no children. My husband and I don't. So my sisters and sister-in-law really filled in for us and came to see me, and they decorated my room and brought pictures of my dogs. They didn't bring pictures of my husband. They brought pictures of my dogs up there. But, I had to have family. I mean, it's tough doing this if you don't have family. And I had church. I had members from our church coming up on a regular basis. I spent 2 Christmases in the hospital. And I told my husband, "Don't worry, I know that there'll still be something going on here." Well, there wasn't. So thank goodness we had people from our church come up and spend some time. And I had a woman that I'd worked with that spent the whole day with us. So, I depended on family and friends. I do a lot of reading about leukemia and about different things like that. I have learned so much from coming from someone that didn't really know anything about leukemia to being able to discuss it somewhat coherently now. So I think that was my family and friends and church, and really just digging in and knowing that I had to be strong.
Incredible. And we are just so grateful again, just that you and Steve were able to join us today and to share your story and just all the incredible work that you're doing to give back and really make a difference in people's lives. So we are out of time, and we've been out of time. So I apologize for keeping everyone over. It's just there are so many amazing questions that were submitted. So sorry that if we weren't able to get through your questions. But thank you again, Dr. Stefanski, Elaine, Erica, Steve, for being here with us today and helping us spread awareness about AML this month. And a special thank you to Erica for the opportunity to partner with Be the Match and for really helping us plan this incredible event for you all today. It would not have been possible truly without all of Erica's work. And so also, if you could all just register to join the donor registry or just learn more to help save someone's life. I know I certainly will, and we'll be spreading the word. So after today's session ends, Zoom will be populating a window to complete a very brief survey for us. We would really appreciate if you could just spend a few minutes to provide us with your thoughts and feedback about the session today, because it truly does help us plan for future programs. And after submitting the survey, there will be a link to enter a drawing to win a prize pack filled with goodies from the Masonic Cancer Center. And then everyone who tuned in today, excluding University of Minnesota affiliated staff, students, or employees, will be entered into a drawing to win a $25 e-gift card. So keep an eye on your email, because 2 lucky attendees will receive that gift card. And then join us for our next Fireside Chat next month on July 19th from 2:30 to 3:30 in recognition of Glioblastoma Awareness Month. And lastly, please be sure to follow the Masonic Cancer Center on all of our social media platforms to stay up to date on our future announcements and events from the Office of Community Outreach and Engagement. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you for staying with us over time. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you again, Dr. Stefanski, Erica, Steve, and Elaine for the time today and for staying over as well. So
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a beautiful evening. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.